Hello, welcome to the Building Public Commitment and Engaging Diverse Stakeholders. My name is Christy Rangel, and I serve as the Public Health Education Chief for the City of Houston Health Department. Today's session will function as a bit of a case study around our city's citywide effort to address implicit bias in school discipline. Today's session has three goals. The first is to help our viewers to really understand how government co-creating with advocacy groups, youth, and community provides the transparency that is needed to create the trust that is needed to make change. Second is to really highlight and show that systems change must always be multi-system, and to demonstrate that trust is something that can't be dictated to community, but it must be earned. And with that, I want to start off by sharing a little bit about the Citywide Implicit Bias Initiative and why and how it came to happen. I am going to share a PowerPoint, and hopefully I will get here. I hope that you guys can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Christy.
Okay, thank you. So here in Houston, My Brother's Keeper is housed in the City of Houston Health Department. Our city took up this initiative as a way to really demonstrate that public health is more than just, shots and measles, and I can point out COVID, but that is really the social determinants of health. And so the citywide effort to address implicit bias has a very diverse group of core partners. We have our mayor's office. So we have our Harris County Juvenile Probation Department. We have Mental Health America, in which we have housed the Center for Behavioral Health. We have, of course, us, the Health Department, My Brother's Keeper. We also have a advocacy group called One Houston, another advocacy group called Leadership for Educational Equity, and then Bloomberg, which has served as our technical advisor. And as we think about our charge, this very diverse core group of stakeholders, our charge and our work was really around this conversation about addressing the inequities so that growing up in Houston is no longer a public health risk. Also, too, is to come together and champion more equitable policies and practices that support the whole child and cut the achievement gap, as it pertains to scholars in Houston. And so one of the things that we started our work with in our conversation around was data, and really digging in and thinking about this conversation around school discipline and disproportionality, and really what does it look like when we talk about this conversation around the school to prison pipeline. You talk about school to prison pipeline, and many people think that a kid's in school and then magically one day they're in prison. It is really a little bit more complicated and nuanced than that. So our juvenile probation department provided us data in which we could really see the scope of the disparities, not just in school discipline, but in justice overall. And so City of Houston, Black youth make up 19% of the population, but they make up 47% of the referrals to schools. And so when you then drill down from this conversation around youth to juvenile probation, a little bit of, so about 40 something % of the referrals to juvenile probations come directly from school districts. And when we took a look at that data, we were then able to see that, you know, Black youth still 19% of our city, but they make up 41% of the referrals from schools. Hispanic youth make a larger percentage of our population at 52%, but they make up 45% of the referrals. Not such a disparity, but still a very high number. And then when we took a deeper look and looked at the reasons for these referrals, we found out that by and large, most of these referrals from schools, they were misdemeanors. That means that the student did not have to be referred. And so when we think about this conversation around mandatory versus discretionary, and we start to think, you know, if we're referring youth of color, especially Black youth, more often from schools to juvenile probation, you know, this conversation about whether or not you have to send them or not is huge because the ramifications are big. When you take a look at the data, it shows that, you know, students who are suspended or expelled, they are 3 times more likely to be involved with juvenile probation, so within the following school year. And as we took a look at this conversation around mandatory versus discretionary punitive, so discipline practices, we found that in the state of Texas, there are 6 factors that should always be taken into account: self-defense, intent, so disciplinary history, disability, foster care involvement, and homelessness. And so as we took this information and we really then started to drill down and think, okay, you know, if these factors are supposed to be taken into account, and so some of our most vulnerable students are still finding themselves in this process, you know, how do we bring together not just school systems, but all stakeholders together to really start to think about some of the biases that exist, not just within systems, single systems, not just in single person, but collectively that we share. So we started off with a training of over 100 city leaders from nonprofit, government, school districts, and they went through a implicit and bias training. From there, we then had a second session where we created work groups for us to really think about and drill down on what exactly this conversation looks like multi-sector. And then we created these work groups. And so out of these 3 work groups were created, one, to really look at in-school resources, not just what's in schools, but what are the resources that would be needed by schools and school districts for them not to default to punitive practices. The second work group was around what types of trainings and things that need to take place in this new paradigm shift. And the third one was really talking about and thinking about the conversation around data and accountability. Because in order for us to start this conversation, we did not have the right school data. We had to go outside of school and look at juvenile probation to really give us a better, honest view of what happens to kids in schools in terms of punitive discipline practices. So after this creation, we then, over the course of 4 or 5 months, we had people come together from sectors across our city, and they convened together, and they looked at data. We did best practices scans. We held focus groups. We interacted with more than 400 community members. So we had house meetings. And so from this work, we were then able to really take a look at the problem and think about the policies that are currently in place and the policies that can be there, and then identify the programs and the people that could really make systemic change. And from that, from our from our 3 work groups, we were able to come up with 9 recommendations to schools around where we can start this process of really addressing the whole student in creating school spaces that are less punitive. The first one was around improving student counselor ratio. In Houston, so we have districts who have 1 counselor to every 1,200 students. Also, so redefining the role of counselors so that we have more mental health supports for students, and it's not just a counselor who does schedules and testing. Also, too, taking a look at and really defining the mandatory social and emotional learning training for educators. Our state mandated training for educators, but there was no framework for what that training looks like. And there's no supports for it to be more than just a one-off, one-day training. Also, too, increasing the number of community schools. So schools that have schools that have the wraparound supports that are needed in order for them to really fully support children and their families. Number 5 was really taking a look at the structure of a in-school practice where students are involved before you decide to expel or so in-house suspend a student. 6 was really taking a look at the district's code of conduct, not just in the wording, but to really take a look at them in terms of an equity framework. So what does that look like? What are the systems that need to be there? Number 7 was to establish mandatory implicit bias training, not just for students, but for so not just for teachers and administrators, but for students and for parents and communities, so that we have the shared understanding of what it takes for us to de-bias ourselves and our systems. Number 8 was really coming up with a district-wide equity policy. When we looked at all our districts, none of our districts had anything in writing about equity policies. And then 9 was really to dig into the data and to really do a longitudinal look at what are the ramifications to our city as it pertains to workforce and so life expectancy, as it relates to these practices. And so with these 9 recommendations, we were then able to really start the work with a whole array of providers and evaluators, in concert with advocacy groups like Children's Defense Fund and Communities in Schools and Teach for America, Moms Demand Action, and really bring to the table our top 7 school districts to the tune of 500,000 students to really start to systemically get to work to figure out exactly what this process should look like for us to be able to transform our schools. And with that, I want to now have our panelists introduce who they are and so what their organizations are and why they are involved in this effort. And I'll start off with Marcus.
Thank you, Christy. Hello, everybody. My name is Marcus Siniceros, and I'm a senior director at the organization called Leadership for Educational Equity. We're a national nonprofit organization whose aim is to change laws and policies on behalf of kids through the leadership development of our members. And so we were really able to come to this project with Christy's invitation and thinking about how can we bring people who are active in the community, who have direct service engagement with young people, and who see the inequities happening in schools every day that want to try to make a difference. And oftentimes when we think about educators, specifically teachers, it's hard to think about how I can change anything beyond the four walls of my classroom. So the invitation here to be able to engage with city government, with county leaders, and other advocacy organizations to be able to make change was a really exciting moment for us. And part of our work is supporting what we call organizing alliances. And the organizing alliance in Houston is called One Houston. So I'll pass it to Ashton, who's one of our leaders, one of our community organizing leaders.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. So good afternoon to everyone. My name is Ashton Millette, and I'm one of the organizers with One Houston, one of the co-leaders of our Disrupting and Dismantling the School to Prison Pipeline team. Also, I'm a student at the University of Houston, and how I got into this work was as a teacher. So I was an 8th grade social studies teacher, coach track, coach football, and a lot of the same inequities that I saw happening as a student back in Louisiana, where I grew up at, were the same inequities that I continue to see as a teacher as well. And that's what spurred me to become an organizer with One Houston and do this work. And so One Houston fits into all of this, of course, because that community advocacy piece. We are made up of teachers, students, parents, other communities, and I definitely would say that my involvement with One Houston and my organizing issues with them have definitely grown into like the lead guys today. And our work is around the school to prison pipeline and comes from the inequities that we've seen from school discipline that have definitely impacted our Black students in Houston. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Vanessa to introduce herself as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashton. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Ramirez. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Manager for the Harris County Juvenile Probation Department. We are the 3rd largest juvenile justice system. We received referrals for discretionary expulsions, mandatory expulsions from 21 of the 25 school districts here in Harris County. And we were excited to receive Christy's invitation because it was important to be able to look at the raw data to better understand where the challenges persisted. Because of receiving referrals from 21 different school districts, we were able to serve as like the common data tool that school districts, community partners, this initiative could look at to identify where implicit biases, structural racism potentially existed, because we ensured that the biases didn't exist in the existing data collection, data crunching systems, if you will. And so part of our involvement was also based on the fact that we have an executive director and juvenile court judges that truly believe that young people need to stay out in the community and not within residential facilities. And so to better understand where students were transitioning to, it was important for us to also take a close look in the mirror to identify where we could also be a part of the solution, work in partnership with local school districts to ensure that we were setting up youth for success in transitioning out back to their local school districts, and or deciding whether a different program was a better fit for the youth to then outline and then reach their personal goals. So we're very grateful to Christy for having allowed the Harris County Juvenile Probation Department to play a role in this. Oftentimes we, when looking at the school to prison pipeline, we're the last peg before kids end up in the adult criminal justice system. And so we're oftentimes seen as part of the problem, and excited that our executive director and this team wanted to make us a part of the solution on behalf of youth. So thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you so much. And, and we have a great core team here, and we have a poll question that we would like for you guys to answer. If we could put up the poll and just take a quick second for you guys to respond. Okay, and the question around the school to prison nexus. We're all familiar with the conversation around the school to prison pipeline, which I told you has a connotation of it being passive, as a very kind of passive thing. But really, when we look at it, it's really a nexus when we talk about this conversation around school discipline. It is really, we can equate with data. So the stats around mass suspensions to mass incarceration. And with that being said, Ashton, can you tell us how different has it been being involved in this initiative from other efforts that you've been in? What has been the difference in this effort?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I actually remember like one of the first calls that I was on, I was a little bit nervous because I saw people from the mayor's office and people from all of these like really big name organizations that I have been seeing around Houston. And I remember like right after that call, Arshel, one of the other leaders or part of that group, she told me, she was like, you have the space to speak up. Like you can like be yourself. You can like say what you need to say. Like we want your voice as a part of this. As Christy, of course, you always have the motto of like us baking the cake together. I think like one of the biggest things for me that's been different from other, efforts that I've been a part of has just been the affirmation of just my voice, my identity, and that happening from the very beginning definitely set the tone, and it just kept me going. It kept me like taking risks. It's kept my imagination continuing to be a part of it. And I really want to say that this experience has made me feel like I have the space to like have my voice heard and then actually do something about it, right? Like not only just talk about it, but be a part of like the actual system change. And something like super to me, especially doing, because education is supposed to be a gateway to opening up the American dream for us. And because of our school discipline systems in our education system, the American of us, and me being able to do this work gives me the opportunity to unlock that American. So that's been.
Thank you so much, Ashton. Vanessa, would you like to share?
Absolutely. A number of things made this whole initiative special. I think it was just the number of different partners represented at the table, private sector, public sector, but I think it was great to also see both systems, the juvenile justice system and the school districts sitting side by side, looking at the same data and trying to dig deeper into identifying effective strategies like the 9 that we ended up with to really start, developing the conditions for system change. I think the second piece that I thought was incredibly important for this initiative was the implicit bias training. I think people come to the table with different definitions for structural racism, equity, inequity, implicit biases, and that training allowed us to really help level set And I think that that was very, very important for building trust, because we started off by making people feel comfortable in their discomfort. And I think it's difficult to have these real conversations about kids, about race, about implications that that brings in determining whether someone needs to be suspended, expelled, or slap on the wrist, in order for us to really get to the core issues, and then start from there to build up to these really important responses and solutions that can be a part of each of our systems changes. And so very, very grateful for that training, and very grateful for the foresight that the city and Bloomberg had in ensuring that that was a core piece of how we responded.
Yes.
Sure. I'd like to say that, personally, as a former classroom teacher who has had students have to be referred to juvenile justice system, and feeling extremely hopeless in that situation, just knowing their potential and knowing the lives that were ahead of them just sort of ruined in these moments, in these moments in a school building. It's really important for me to be driven into this work and to think about how do we prevent that from happening at a systemic level for students, not just here in Houston, but across Texas and across the country. I think about how the criminal justice system has affected my own family and the stories that exist within this space. And this project was a chance for us to really think about how can we have access now to the potential to change things in a way. And that was just extremely exciting and liberating. And it'd be remiss if we didn't recognize yesterday being the 1 year anniversary of Houston native George Floyd's death and murder, and thinking about what our country was having a conversation about, and so many people calling for reform or change, or thinking about how people of color, and particularly Black Americans, are impacted by policing or criminal justice system. And so many people saying, I don't know what to do. How can I be helpful? And the thing that this project let us do is say, come do this. This is the reform. When you see injustice happening, this is the space for you to do it. And so being able to have that offering to folks in Houston over the past year and a half, 2 years, has been really important. And then I'll say professionally, our organization is a leadership development organization. We try to teach folks how to be civically engaged in a way that does change laws and policies. And we typically utilize the policy framework of the 3 windows. A policy can change if you know the problem, if it's wide felt, if you understand the policy that needs to be different, and if you have the person window, who's the person who can make that change, whether it's an individual or a body of leaders. And many times as community organizers or advocates, we have to work so hard to lift that 3rd window of the person. How do we convince this person that this is the right thing to do? And in this particular case, whether it was the Houston mayor or our county leadership or Vanessa's leaders over at the Harris County Juvenile Probation Department, Henry Gonzalez, the window was opened for us. And that is a unique opportunity, which is why we've been able to, I think, move so quickly with the work that we've been able to do, and we'll talk a little bit more about.
Great. And I think we have another poll question that so we would like for you guys to take. And as you guys are taking this question, and of course, because a lot of our work in the MBK network is about collaboration. Here in Houston, we function as a backbone organization. And I think that this is a very important question, because many times we come together as sectors, but oftentimes youth are not a part of our collaborative work. They may be at the end, or we do dipstick tests with them. We bring them out if we need them to help convince other young people. And so with that, I have a question, and I'm going to start off with Vanessa on this question. What role should young people play in school reform, and how are you working to make that happen? And I think, Vanessa, I wanted to start off with you on this question because there's some very unique work that you're doing through juvenile probation that actually dovetails into this.
Sure. I think there's an important. What I learned, and I'll speak for myself throughout this entire initiative, was how little we knew about existing discipline policies, and I'm speaking for myself. And so I think even for me, crunching data and seeing where there is discretion versus where there isn't discretion, I realized how much our parents and or our youth may not know where that exists. And so I think assuming that youth voice can create and increase student engagement, I think there's been some missed opportunities to help within schools to help youth be a part of how they respond to those expulsions, suspensions where there is discretion. I think getting that youth buy-in from within is going to be imperative for schools, closing that gap. But here from within, so as we are looking at our residential facilities as well, and as we're taking a closer look at what's the right fit for our youth as they return back to community and to not be a part of that revolving door. We took matters into our own hands and started developing a community-based program that isn't just going to exist out in the community, but will actually begin within residential facilities that really starts responding to kids' workforce development needs, if you will. And so something that we very much know is that, kids who are sometimes involved in the juvenile justice system, they've had touch points with our system or in school suspension, out of school suspension. And so that truancy piece hasn't really developed the ability to show up every day and on time. And we knew that ultimately, in order for our kids to reach financial stability, or even stop that, just to get out of crisis mode, workforce development has to be a necessary component of that response and solution. And so what our chief and juvenile court judges and leadership team decided to do was, enough of the, but ifs, let's be a part of the solution. We've begun to bring vocational training partners within our facilities, but it's not just your typical career tech program. It's really about attaching the right employers who understand the role that they must play to help ease that transition back out to community. But even as they begin with these exposure activities and bite-sized trainings inside facilities to really hook them on what's possible for them, right? And it's not just welding or electrical. A lot of our kids can do, all of our kids can do so many different things. It's just a matter of providing them the guardrails and the pathway and the support system to be able to navigate the barriers to employment that are going to exist, because they exist for people who aren't in this pathway, but just the support system in place, but also a space within community that is responding holistically to those barriers once they transition out. So we're talking having on-site social services, so therapy and restorative justice practices, because we sometimes hold kids to not responding in ways that we've never taught them to, right? So why not ensure that we are incorporating that in programming that's not siloed, but it's integrated in the academic piece and the vocational training piece, and even in the pretty exciting earn and learn model where youth now get paid to complete their academic component, vocational training, because it is a luxury sometimes to think about a 2-year vocational program, but I have to eat yesterday and I have to bring food to the table today because I'm the man of the house or the woman of the house. And so we're looking at this issue in a 360 way and plugging in all the partners, many of whom are a part of this citywide implicit bias initiative, to be a part of the solution, so that as kids are working towards diplomas, GEDs, vocational trainings, they're also developing the necessary skills that will help them get the job, keep the job, and go after financial stability. And so we've started with a core group of youth. We have youth who are already earning credentials and have been working, earning wages. And recidivism rates just keep dropping and dropping, and we'll be excited to report out how far we get once we're able to move into a much bigger facility, just based on the demand that there is out there for kids who just want to get to work, just need access and support.
Thank you. Marcus, can you share with us a little bit about the role that youth should play in this conversation and the work around school reform, and some of what Lee is actively doing to help facilitate that?
Absolutely. Again, as a classroom teacher, I really believe that my students should be leading the classroom and the learning and doing the work. And coming out into the world of public policy or issue advocacy or community organizing, I brought that belief with me in that when we go into a space to talk about young people and how our policies are impacting young people, those conversations should never be had without young people in the room, because they are the ones who are most proximate to the issue, and they should be the leaders on that issue. And so throughout this project, we've been very intentional about ensuring that young people were at the table. And as Christy, as you mentioned, not just as sort of table dressing or just to check in and say, look, there's some kids over there. But they were leading sessions. We were working with them to guide and to facilitate. They were leading in small groups. We had several hundred interactions with young people and their families through what we call house meetings. Ashton could talk a little bit about that as a community organizing practice. But we heard from them. What are you experiencing at school? And we took those stories and we compared them to the data that we were seeing, and really being able to present that numeric information to folks, along with a story of the 9-year-old that it could be impacting, or the 12-year-old that it could be impacting. And then I think as we continue to move into this project, it became a little bit more formalized. We were able to apply for funding together and be able to launch a really unique community of practice that had both school system leaders from 7 of our largest school districts here in the Houston area, where the superintendent and their chief level staff were able to gather and have conversations about an issue like the student code of conduct, and think through what could they as systems leaders make changes on. And then in their school buildings, we had teachers who became Leadership for Educational Equity Fellows that were organizing with their students. So students were having the exact same conversations that the superintendents were having. And in the next few weeks, those student policy recommendations and the work that they've been able to do will be presented to the senior leaders of their school systems. And as facilitators of this project, we've been able to make sure that that table is set for them to come through, right? So we're able to remove a lot of these barriers that have typically kept young people out of policy conversations, and have typically kept, some of our senior leaders, even though they're friends, from engaging with us and with young people in the past. And so that this project, I think, has really ensured that we are not saying anything that the student, that we would run into the hallway wouldn't say themselves. And that's really, really important for us.
Ashton, can you share with us about house meetings, the convening of young people in the advocacy space in this project, and where they really have a voice, not just to say what's happening, but to shape the work?
Yeah, for sure. So with One Houston, one of the organizing tools that we use, of course, is house meetings. House meetings is just small group meetings, different people from different backgrounds, and of course, a lot has been involved with some of our youth. One Houston even has a junior board that is also very active, very involved in every single thing that we do. And in those house meetings, of course, like everybody has a voice. And like to even like touch more on even the importance of having like youth voice. And I'll even like put myself in there because I'm still a young adult myself. You know, like young people are leaders and young people have voices too. And I think like part of the session earlier today talked about like changing the narrative. And I think like one big piece of the narrative for young people is that like we're oblivious or, you know, we're naive about things that's happening, but very aware, like not only myself as like an older young adult, but like even like the middle school kids that I taught in Houston, very aware of everything that's going on. And I think again, the importance of having like a youth voice is, you know, the youth bring imagination, creativity, and a perspective that you know, many older folks just might not have. And I think as we continue to see like social media kind of like shape our world, and like we have like even more access to information, right? Like we're seeing everything going on, especially with the summer last year, the murder of George Floyd. Like we're looking to create a new world, you know, a world that definitely fits us, fits our needs. And, you know, that's where the organizing model also comes into, right? Like we do this deep listening through house meetings. And then of course we have actions that follows that, you know, give youth, give young people the vehicle and the opportunity to even like create and craft that world that we envision and that we see.
And we have one last poll question for you guys to answer. And this question is very important to this conversation, especially I feel like for myself as a person who sits in city government. You know, when we talk about in public health, there's always this conversation about the persons of trust model. And so the reality for many of us, if we sit in certain sectors, you know, namely government, you know, local, national, especially in these times, it can be a very kind of a slippery conversation about this word about trust. And so the honest answer is that trust, so with community, isn't something that you tell them to have in you. It must be earned. And I think that in thinking about this initiative, in the way that we've been able to gain momentum because we are aligned, but that because we are viewed as trusted, you know, people by the various stakeholders in our community in various different ways. Can I have you, Marcus, start off with telling us why you would encourage other cities to adopt this type of model where you're baking the cake together, where you start off grass tops, grassroots, advocacy, government, you know, together. Can you share why other cities should think about this type of model? And then can you share some of the benefits and some of the potential barriers they may face?
Absolutely. Well, I think with any level of systems change that is going to be successful, it has to have a strong ecosystem of leaders from different sectors that are able to come together and share their needs and to really and like truly do the work alongside each other. I think that is such a necessary element here. And I've been very proud of the work that we've done through the citywide effort to address implicit bias project here in Houston about being able to ensure and that the right people were there. And the right people is like who shows up. The right people is who wants to be a part of this conversation. The right people is the one that raises their hand and say like, tell me where to be and I'll go. And I think that that's a very important aspect of this work. in community organizing, there's a principle, and it's called no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. And if we think about government, and Christy, from the health department, from the city, will be the first to tell you, like, people have often mistrust government, right? And we see that happening across the country right now, where people who are advocates or who are organizers, there is this natural tension between the system and the people. And that's real. That is going to exist. There are reasons that it exists. When we talk about the disproportionate impact of school discipline, that's teachers, that's schools, like that's us. And so as part of this particular project, we had to be really vulnerable in saying, my sector owns this problem. My sector wants to solve this problem. I can't do that without you. And so as a city, if you're in city leadership, or if you're in public, nonprofit leadership or advocacy, whatever it is that you're doing, there has to be this element of work where you say, like, look, I know that there's been harm done, but I have to be in relationship with the folks who can make the changes. And I have to be in relationship with them until I can't be anymore, all right? Until they've lost that trust. And so one of the things that I really truly believe that this project is, and I hope that it's inspiring for others, is that trust is incredibly important, and it's also incredibly fragile. And so we have to treat it with respect. And on this topic in particular, the last thing I'll share is that when we are talking about the data points, those are kids. Those are 9 to 17-year-olds. Those are specifically kids of color. They are young Black boys and girls. They are young brown boys and girls. And those are their lives that we're talking about. So if we're able to decrease the amount of referrals, if we're able to increase the access points for them, those are people's lives that are being changed. And I don't think that you build trust any way better than helping to give people a better opportunity for the life that they've chosen for themselves. And so I definitely encourage folks to think about how you're operating within your community, and think about, is there anything different that you could be doing to build trust?
Vanessa?
Literally say ditto what Marcus said. Beautifully said. I think the oftentimes we are trying to disrupt systems outside in, right? And because we're looking at things from a very specific perspective that's on the receiving end of something, right? Or had they received this type of education, had they received this service within school, had they received this within the juvenile justice system. I think what made this incredibly special, beyond all the things that I've already mentioned here today, sitting in those work groups at those tables and having representation from all of those different perspectives, it ensured that that even if someone did want to get defensive and justify their why, there were so many different perspectives that met them where they were and then wanted to be a part of the solution. And I think that's ultimately the goal of what we're trying to do. It's not just about, the problem and whose fault is it, and then let's, disrupt that system, but rather all of us playing a role and looking in the mirror to identify what's our role in the problem, and then what's our role going to be in the solution. Because ultimately it's about the kids that are represented in those, orange and blue lines. It's about how we can prevent from not just those lines, increasing, but also how can we get ahead of it? I mean, it requires that every partner want to be a part of the solution, and that requires trust. Absolutely. I think what could potentially be a barrier, but what was also such a wonderful benefit, was the facilitation, and I think that's going to be key for these conversations. And I think the way we started with Dr. Brian Marks, and then the facilitation happening from within the team, but also then identifying people from these work groups and the steering committee who wanted to raise their hand and say, I will own this. I want to be a part of identifying, policy or programs or people, because I'm in a position to do that. I think that was all necessary. But I think what made that possible was being able to facilitate that outcome. So just, being, aware of that.
Ashton.
Yeah, to look on time, I'll try to be as brief as possible as well. But I think with this model, if a city wants to uplift marginalized voices and really focus on equity, like this is the model where you can actually do that. This is the vehicle to make that happen. I think from an advocacy space, much like what Marcus said, like to see the people window open, that gives us as organizers, as advocates, a whole new energy, a whole new swagger to just know that we can go out there, take risks, and anything could be possible. And I think in terms of like a barrier from a city perspective, I would say to look out for is fear. So don't be afraid to take a step back and don't be afraid to step up. So by take a step back, I mean like what Ms. Chrissy said, like building that cake together. Don't be afraid to like relinquish power to some of the advocates, to some of the nonprofit leaders around you that's trying to do this with you. But also don't be afraid to step up, right? So when it's time to move, when it's time to act, like you have to step up, even though it might look a little messy. You might not know what might end up happening at the end. You can't be afraid to step up as well.
Thank you. I do see that we don't have any questions in the Q&A, and I know that we are running right up against time, but I did want to pause for a second to see if anyone had a question that they wanted to be in the Q&A before I close out the session. Okay, it doesn't appear that we're going to have any questions, and I think for me, what I just want to say to everyone, and what I would really say to to city leaders and our people who work with government is this real whole conversation around trust and transparency. And many times as city leaders or leaders in general, we build our mythos on being confident and being sure. And this whole process is really where we're all sure about the disproportionality and the equity issue, and we're not so sure sometimes even what part we play in this work. And so for us as a city, and the thing that I'm most proud about is that I work for a health department director and a mayor that allow for this conversation to happen and to make room for there to be these conversations, but not only conversations, but these action steps towards this. Our purview as a city and a county is that this is not 1 year, 2 year, 3 year work, but this is 5 years, 15 years, 20 years work. We are committed together along with all of our stakeholders and everybody involved in this work to really start to peel back the layers and go in places that so we may not have thought of before. We are currently in a legislative session where a lot of things that we were advocating for may not happen. So now we're talking about who are the other groups, the ACLU and some of the other people that we may have been engaged with that we may want to figure out a longer game plan. And so I would just say to everyone, this is a real honest way for you to get out of your corners and not assign roles of villain and hero or victim, but for everybody to say that we're in this together, all kids matter, and that we are going to step up and be accountable for ourselves. And with that, I want to thank my panel, Vanessa, Marcus, Ashton. I cannot have asked for a better group of people to continue this work with together. And thank you so much.